Hunters, nature is cold. All of God's creatures are thrust into this world and scramble to survive. There are only so many deer that will make it through the winter without starving to death. Only so many fish will live through infancy without being eaten. And there's only room for so many of each creature in our forests before they begin to throw off the ecosystem. Wolves are a prime example. They're nuisances. They thrive on vulnerable livestock and rip through populations of prey like deer, elk, rabbits, and whatever else they can catch. That's where the hunters come in. When nature goes unchecked, it destroys itself. I'm an avid hunter, and I have been for as long as I can remember. I have trekked into the woods many times to harvest game, on this occasion to aid in population control. The state of Idaho is rich in wildlife, and among this wildlife is quite the dense wolf population. As a result, the state government has permitted year-round hunting and trapping of wolves, even offered a bounty of $2,000 a head. So needless to say, I was eager to capitalize. There was nothing extraordinary about the woods as I plunged myself into the tree line that day. It was an experience I'd had many times before. I parked my truck on the shoulder of the highway just beside the tree line, slung my bolt-action .223 over my right shoulder, and started into the woods that morning like I had so many other times. The deceiving tranquility lulling me into a false sense of security. The fog hung heavily that morning. The dew resting on the grass was plentiful and wet my pant legs as I trekked through it. The birds chirped their gentle woodland symphonies, and the squirrels chattered proudly. But there was a beast in those woods that made no sound. In every sense, this was the calm before the storm. I hiked to a nearby downward slope, which led into a valley, on the other side of which was another incline continuing the mountain. The trees thinned out in the valley, but didn't entirely dissipate. The incline opposite the hill I stood on, however, was thickly packed with trees, just as the one I stood upon was. In the valley below, they scattered considerably when compared to the densely packed together evergreens which engulfed the incline I had been hiking. The decline leading into the valley was the same as the incline, packed densely with evergreens which shrouded my vision. But from my vantage point, I could see the trees become sparser in the valley below. This area specifically is known for its dense wolf population. And as I hiked the incline, I noticed droppings, not only from what appear to be wolves, but of their prey. I knew that I was in a prime spot for finding my prey. If they didn't appear in the morning mist, I knew they would certainly appear in the dim glow of twilight. I began to hike down the slope toward the valley. I would set up shop in the tree line and wait, staring into the valley, studying it until I found them. I knew for a fact I would see them here. The morning went by without a sound save for the birds and squirrels. Through midday, I knew my hunt was at a standstill. Wolves aren't active in the midday sun, like most of the other creatures of the forest. The wolves are most active when their prey are, and so it wouldn't be until near nightfall that I had hope again. I decided to take a walk and take in my surroundings to pass the time. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, just in case I did see something, and ventured into the valley where the trees thinned out. The valley stretched for at least a mile and a half on either side of my point of emergence from the thick tree line. I started to the right. It became clear rather immediately that there was something that frequented that valley. I thought at first it was a bear because of the markings it left on some of the trees. I came across at least 5 different evergreens that had been clawed by something with great force and massive claws. The claw marks were bigger than any territorial markings I had ever seen left by any bear, and truthfully, the thought of being alone in the territory of a bear large enough to leave such impressive gashes in these trees was unsettling. My 223 would do just fine against wolves, even mountain lions, but a bear of this size could practically spit the bullets back at me. As I reached the end of the right side of the valley, I found something laid out before the tree line. It was a gruesome sight to behold alone in the woods. The mangled carcass of a full-grown bull moose lay at the base of the incline. Its abdomen was splayed open, its innards strewn about the forest floor around it, and its rib cage ripped to pieces which were scattered around the grisly scene. There was a slash that spanned from the base of one of its paddles, stretching across its eye, which was split in two by the savage attack, and down its snout, which was split so wide and deep you could see the tongue in its mouth through the gash. It didn't smell yet. I didn't even see a single ant on the body. It was fresh. At the earliest, whatever demolished this gargantuan had done so the night before, and most likely was to return that night. There was still plenty of meat to be had. It wasn't done here. The thought of a monster this vicious being so close and potentially returning was mortifying. But I wasn't willing to abandon the valley. I had seen plenty of signs of wolves in the area, and I had a clear lane to shoot down thanks to the valley and vantage point I had been sitting on the nearby incline. I decided I would just have to distance myself as much as possible from the carcass and the tree markings. I figured if I distanced myself, it would be fine. I had seen enough of that valley. I didn't want to go stomping around down there any further. I retreated to the incline where I had sat down my belongings. When I found my way back to the spot I had found, I decided to move even further down the mountain, away from the fresh carcass. I cautiously walked along the incline towards the left side of the valley. I wasn't going to explore it any further, but I wanted to find a shooting lane further away from the carcass than the one I had been sitting at. About half a mile to the left, there was a perfect shooting lane, possibly even better than the first I had found. In the valley below, the trees were scattered so sparsely that I left large pieces of land uncovered. I had seen thicker vegetation in city parks than the scarcely vegetated stretch of valley that I was overlooking. Best part about it all was that as I looked through my rifle scope at the trees, I saw no territory markings. I think I was close enough to the other markings that it probably didn't matter either way. If whatever made those markings stumbled upon me, or I it probably would still rip me to pieces. I took some semblance of solace in the lack of the markings, at the very least. I thought it would help me think about the beast less, ease some of the tension in my gut. As nightfall crept nearer, that thought proved incorrect. As the sun slowly descended behind the peak of the incline in front of me, and the shadows grew long, my mind raced. It would be returning to retrieve its dinner by now. I was a mere 2 miles away from it. I don't know why it bothered me. I had been in close proximity with animals all my life, including bears. I couldn't get that grisly image of the dead moose out of my head. It looked like it had been hit by a freight train the way its abdomen was burst open. It looked more like roadkill than any prey I had ever seen. Dusk fell slowly, and the howling began promptly. I had been beginning to think the wolves weren't to return that night to avoid whatever hulking monster had picked that moose apart. Wolves aren't above scavenging, but I doubt they'd be brave enough to steal from something like that. The howling was close. They weren't quite in my shooting lane yet, but I could hear them progressively getting closer to the piece of valley I was overlooking. Eventually, I saw 4 of them jog in from the right, completely unaware of my presence. Or if they were aware, they certainly didn't make it obvious. I shouldered my rifle as they pitter-pattered past and took aim. The way they moved made it difficult to get a clean heart shot. They didn't jog in a straight line, but instead zigged and zagged, as if they were consciously trying to avoid the reticle of my rifle. I nestled my finger to the trigger and drew in a deep breath as I prepared to squeeze off a shot. Before my finger fully actuated the trigger, another howl cut through the silent mountain night. This howl was different. It was long and deep, deeper than any wolf I had ever heard before. I removed my finger from the trigger as the ghostly howl echoed through the night. The wolves stopped dead in their tracks as it bellowed, but only for a moment before they all took off in the opposite direction of the howl. The wolves sprinted faster than I had ever seen an animal move up to that point, further to the left side of the valley. As they escaped, I heard the howl again, this time closer. In fact, much closer than before. My eyes began to scan the valley below me, thinking that soon I would have another opportunity if this wolf was also moving in my direction. But I saw no wolf. What I saw was an abomination, something straight out of a nightmare. I heard it before I saw it. I don't just mean its howls. Before it ever entered my line of sight, I could hear its footsteps thudding against the forest floor, cracking stakes under its massive feet. My eyes darted back and forth along the valley, as I thought that if I could hear it, surely I'd be able to see it. Roughly a minute after the voracious footsteps became audible, I saw it shooting from the right side of the valley at an incredible speed. It didn't run on all fours like an animal, though. It rather stood bipedal like a man, and at that, stood at about 8 feet tall. I followed it with my eye through the scope of my rifle the best I could. Though it was lightning fast, I saw in detail the beast's features. The black fur which covered the beast hung from its body like Spanish moss from an ancient oak tree. Its ears were slenderer than a wolf's ears, the cavity narrower, and they peaked with points fine as needles. On both the feet that it propelled itself with, and at the end of its long muscular arms, were claws the size of steak knives, presumably sharp as razor blades. Drool streamed from the corners of its long, wrinkled snout as it ran, and in its ajar jaw, teeth like a great white's lined the black gums. Through all of this, the feature that struck the most horror in me was its eyes. This beast had white, cloudy eyes, reminiscent of a morning fog. I could practically see behind them. I saw nothing but ravenous hatred. I drew in breaths slowly as I pulled the rifle scope from my eye and watched the outline of the monster dart further down the valley, out of my line of sight. The beast's eyes haunted me. There is a supernatural quality about those stormy eyes. It looked as if you stared into them for too long. You may be sucked in. As I could hear it get further and further away, his footsteps becoming ever so slightly quieter in the night, I noticed something across the valley that I hadn't noticed in the daylight. There looked to be a porch light in the distance on the other side of the valley, about halfway up the incline just in front of my position. It was a significantly shorter walk across than was the walk to my truck. Besides, I didn't want to plunge myself into the darkness with that thing out there, surely looking for prey to ravage. I moved with panicked fervor as I descended into the valley from my position on the incline. I held my rifle in a low ready position, though judging from the size of the beast, I seriously doubted that the 5 rounds of .223 in my rifle's magazine would be enough to kill it. As I started up the incline, I heard a high-pitched yelp in the distance, from the direction the wolves ran in. I figured it had caught up. It was strange that it was going after the wolves, because it looked almost canine itself, though I didn't know what kind of canine walked on 2 legs like a man and had claws like steak knives. My heart pounded in my chest as the distant yelping persisted. Before any time at all had passed, it wasn't just the one wolf I could hear yelping in the distance. It was a discordant onslaught of snarls, cries, and yips coming from that direction. The beast was killing them all. The wolves didn't stand a chance. Finally, I stood on the doorstep of the cabin I could see from a distance. The porch light illuminated it just enough for me to see the perfectly ordinary, if not a bit homely, cabin. It was a very small cabin, which had no particularly interesting features, though the wood which made it up looked very old. The deck protruded about 10 feet from the front door and stretched to either side of the front wall of the cabin. There was a wooden railing which spanned around the entirety of the deck, except for in the center, where it parted to create an entrance. 2 stairs leading to the part in the railing. The porch light was dingy and dim up close, but in the abyssal blackness of the mountain night, it practically looked like a bright shining beacon from a distance. I pounded on the wooden door with a closed fist. "Hello," I shouted. "I need some help. Please, I'm not going to hurt you. There's something in the woods." There was no response to my cries for help. I waited for what was in reality about 2 minutes, but what felt like an eternity, standing on the porch, listening to the chaotic turmoil deep down the valley. And suddenly it all came to a halt. There was no more yipping or yelping to speak of. Instead, a silence that echoed just as voraciously through the dark. Tired of waiting and terrified of what the beast may be doing, I pounded on the door once more and screamed, "Please open the door!" There was still no response, or even a subtle shuffling in the house, except for the glowing porch light. It seemed totally abandoned. I wasn't going to stand around on that porch anymore. I had to force my way in. I wasn't particularly keen on breaking and entering somebody's home with a gun in my hand, especially not in Idaho where everyone was armed. But it was preferable to facing the wild, ravenous monster in the woods. I grasped the door handle and found, to my surprise, the cabin wasn't locked. The interior of the cabin didn't look abandoned, though most of the furniture looked ancient. It was free of dust or cobwebs. Somebody lived here. "Hey," I called out, desperately hoping the occupant would hear me. "Hey, I'm sorry I let myself in, but there's something in the woods. I need help getting out of here, or a place to stay until morning." There was still no response. I began to go room to room in the cabin. Not that there were many rooms to explore. There was the main living room and kitchen area, which was in the same room, but divided by a single wooden beam. Just past that was a short hallway, with a door on the right side of the wall about halfway through it, and a door at the end of it. The living room and kitchen were similarly dull, but it did oddly lack any modern amenities, with the exception of a gas stove and sink stationed in the kitchen. In the living room area, there was only one wooden rocking chair with a small end table to the side of it. Atop the end table in the living room area was a half-empty fifth of Evan Williams bourbon that was missing its cap. A few sparse spatters of whiskey dropped on the table from where someone had tipped the bottle to their lips a moment too early. The rocking chair was pointed to a fireplace, and offsetting the uninspiring living room, a human skull sat on the mantel above the fireplace. My stomach twisted itself into knots as I looked at the skull on the mantel. My mind raced. I threw my rifle up to my shoulder and began towards the room halfway down the hall. But before I got the chance, the front door violently swung open, thudding against the wall with the handle. I shot around to find an old man stumbling through the doorway, holding his stomach as blood seeped through his clothes, pumping out through between his fingers, which compressed on his midsection. The man had long, gray hair, which cascaded down the tops of his shoulders. It was frazzled by the sweat which collected itself on his head, and he had a bushy gray beard to accompany it. The bags that drooped down from his eyes looked heavier than he was, but he was no small man either. He was about 200 pounds and 5'11". He wore a red and white checkered button-up shirt like a lumberjack would wear, and blue jeans with a leather belt, off the side of which dangled an 1860 Colt Army model revolver in a black leather holster. The leather holster was engraved with the image of a single wolfsbane plant, the stem starting at the bottom of the holster by the barrel, and the plant stretched up to just before the holster's opening, which the grip of the revolver hung out of. He breathed in jagged, painful breaths as he struggled to stay on his feet in the doorframe. He leaned against the frame of the door, then collapsed to his knees, his elbow falling on the frame as he retched over, holding his wound even tighter. "Help me, goddammit!" the man snarled with what little breath he could find in his lungs. I rushed to his aid and slung his arm around my shoulder to help him walk. I walked him all the way to the rocking chair in the living room, before bolting back to the front door which he had emerged from and slammed it shut, this time pushing the deadbolt into place. The man's blood was all over my hands. It was a disgusting warmth, a warmth that I had felt many times before while cleaning the animals I'd hunted. This was different. I'd never felt the blood of a man. This blood nauseated me. I urgently dashed back to the living room where the man sat, leaking a river of red onto the floor. But when I got there, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help the man. I didn't know if I could help the man. I stood in the center of the room between him and the fireplace and just gawked at the open wound until finally the man faintly said, "Would you sit down? You're making me nervous." I took a seat on the mantel in front of the fireplace and continued to stare. I wanted to say something, but all I could think to say is, "Are you okay?" And it seemed fairly obvious what the answer to that question was. In hindsight, I could have asked him what had done that to him, or if there was anything I could do to help, but my mind was so overwhelmed by his sudden arrival and by the state that he arrived in, it made it nearly impossible to think clearly. The man coughed, drops of red flinging themselves from his lips and onto the hardwood by his boots. He reached over to his side and snatched up the bottle of bourbon, then proceeded to tilt his head back and pour the bourbon into his mouth without letting it make contact with his lips. He held the bottle out to me, for me to take a drink, but I held my hand up and shook my head in refusal. "You're sure?" he asked, swishing the bourbon around. I nodded, and just as soon as I did, he tilted his head back, put his mouth all the way around the bottleneck, blood from his mouth smearing itself all along the lip of the bottle, and sucked down 4 hearty gulps of the amber elixir. The man clutched the gaping gash in his abdomen with one hand and held the bottle with the other hand as he sat, staring at the floor. "What's your name, sir?" he choked out, the very words obviously causing him pain, and never looking up from the floor in front of him. "Roger," I answered, almost relieved that he wanted to begin a conversation instead of just leaving me to feel helpless as he bled to death. "My name's Roger Callahan." "Roger," he said quietly but gruffly. I got something I gotta get off my chest, Roger, and I'm afraid I might not have long to do it." "Okay," I said cautiously but curiously at once. "About 10 years ago, I was camping in these woods, my wife and I, Olivia and I, and when it got dark, we started hearing these real low howls, like nothing we'd ever heard before. And Olivia, well, she got scared, wanted to leave, but the words choked him as tears started forming in his eyes. I told her nothing to worry about, doll. It was just wolves howling at the moon. Talked her into staying that night. Before we went to sleep, something came out of the woods. and it snatched her right up, like a hawk takes a mouse in its talons. I went a searching for my beautiful Olivia that night. I found her, a pile of guts and shredded clothes. His mouth hung open as the tears collecting in his eyes began to fall like fresh rain down a window as he fought to maintain his composure. I got to walk away, and I started looking for the creature what did it. And I found myself spiraling into a world where I got a lot of good people hurt. People trying to help me. And I don't think I'll ever get to tell those people how sorry I am. I have so much blood on my hands. I guess I just wanted to let someone know that I'm sorry. As he went on, his voice cracked and the tears continued. I'm so sorry. They didn't deserve what they got. And I lied to myself for a long time. I told myself that I was trying to do the right thing, that I knew these things were out there, that I had to kill them, I had to hunt them. But I wasn't doing the right thing. I was being so selfish. I was doing it to make myself feel better for letting that thing take Olivia, for making Olivia stay with me that night instead of packing up. I was being selfish like I always have been, and I let so many good people die. I'm so fucking sorry. I'm sorry to you, Roger. It's my fault. That thing is in the woods here tonight. That thing that's making all of them deep howls you're hearing. And it's my fault. The owner of this cabin is laying down in the back room with its innards as its outards. I didn't think anyone would get hurt out here. I didn't think there was anyone for it to hurt this far out. Towards the end of his outburst, his speech became very slurred as the whiskey worked its way into his brain. As he finished his drunken confession, I felt my hand tense up on my rifle. What do you mean? The comment you made about the owner of the cabin, what do you mean by that? Take a look, he slurred drunkenly. Take a look in the room at the end of the hall. He covered his eyes in shame and hung his head. I begrudgingly dragged myself to my feet, not wanting to see what the man was going on about, but I knew I had to. I had to make sure he was coherent, wasn't just speaking nonsense. I inched slowly towards the door at the end of the hall, each step feeling like it took an eternity. My heart thumped in my throat as I reached the door. It was cracked open, and I could already smell the sickening metallic stench of blood. I pushed it open to find a scene grislier than my most hellish nightmares could have conjured. I wish I could say that I could tell right away what I was looking at was a man, but I was so mangled I could just barely tell. Tatters of flesh and blood were strewn about the room along with his internal organs. Blood painted the walls and floor of the room. It looked like something had grabbed a hold of one of his severed appendages and shook it ferociously, splattering the blood from the stump all over the walls, even some on the ceiling. The torso lay in pieces on the bed, barely recognizable as a torso. It was ripped into 3 different pieces. 2 chunks of gore that looked vaguely like the lower abdomen, and 1 larger chunk, easily identifiable as the chest, the pectoral tissue still intact, but covered in deep, wide puncture wounds that looked to have come from the teeth of some ravenous animal. And it was missing most of the flesh that covered the rib cage. The head was gone from the torso, but it too lay mangled somewhere in the room, thrown to the far end of it. There were massive holes in the cheeks on the severed head, revealing bloody gums and missing teeth, some of which were scattered across the hardwood floor among the putrescence. The arms and legs were scattered as well, but not all in one piece. Through all the parts scattered about the room were tooth punctures. It looked like the victims were torn apart by a grizzly bear, except at least a grizzly bear would have eaten its victim. As I took in the horrific scene, I retched over and vomited on my feet. I stumbled back to the living room to find the man still conscious, sitting on the rocking chair, silently sobbing to himself as he took a swig from the bottle as he looked up at me. "I'm the reason it's here. That man is dead, all because of me." "What the hell did you do?" He dropped the bottle to the floor, and it tipped over, spilling the bourbon out by his feet. "That..." He put his hand that was gripping the bourbon over his eyes in shame and pointed to the skull on the mantel with the hand that he had been putting pressure on the gash with. "That's yours?" "Yeah," he muttered, sniffling back snot and tears still pouring from his eyes. "See, it wasn't human when I killed it. That skull belonged to one of them. The smell of their home draws them in. Pisses them off, too. Makes them more aggressive, more stupid, easier to kill. The place is empty when I came through last night, and I left it in here. I found our friend in there this morning. Ripped to pieces." As he finished, he lost control of his breathing and began to spiral into hysterical wailing. I could feel my stomach churning inside me. It was too much. The man on the rocking chair sat before me, blood pouring from his stomach and terrible confessions of his sins pouring from his gullet. My face was white as a sheet. I could feel it. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I stood silently watching the man cry tears of guilt. I wanted to reassure him, though I don't know what of. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault. I wanted to tell him he was a good man just trying to do the right thing, but I didn't know him. I didn't even know his name, and it was a name that I was never to learn. The empathy I felt for him made me want to spill out any load of crap that he'd listened to just to calm him down in his last moments. He was losing so much blood and already had lost so much blood. I didn't know how he was holding on. Finally, as the man recovered from his bout of hysteria, he calmed himself back down and once again began drunkenly slurring to me. "I'm sorry I put you through this, Roger. I'm so sorry." I began frantically trying to comfort him, knowing that his minutes were numbered. "It's okay. You didn't mean to. It's not your fault. You thought you were doing the right thing." "No." He shook his head. "It is my fault." His face contorted with misery as he continued. "I lived such a selfish existence, Roger. I can't die the same way I lived." As he cracked out those words, he reached for the percussion revolver in his holster. He drew the revolver from his holster and grabbed it by the barrel, holding the grip out to me. "I'm gonna start to change soon. And when I do, I want you to pull that hammer back and shoot me dead." His words became elongated and slow as he faded away. "Take my revolver with you. It can kill it." I disregarded his ramblings. He'd lost so much blood and he was drunk. I thought that surely anything he was able to choke out in these final moments was nonsense. I grabbed the revolver out of his hand and set it on the mantel behind me, still holding my rifle with the other hand. "You're going to be fine," I assured him repeatedly, but he continued speaking as I did. "Yours is no good. Mine's got silver bullets." Mine's got silver bullets. Mine's got silver bull. His last bit of vitality fluttered away as he finished. His eyes became distant, and I could see the light leave them. His chest no longer pumped up and down, and his eyes no longer spilled tears. His head slouched over to the side as he let out his final breaths, his eyes still stuck open. Jesus Christ, I muttered to myself as I stared down at him. I had never seen anybody die before, and somehow it was more haunting than the mutilated corpse strewn about in the other room. I saw the humanity leave the man's eyes as he became a corpse. His eyes were glassy, nothing behind them but physical matter. I let out a deep exhale and sat on the mantel, leaning my rifle against the wall beside me as I did. I folded my hands and put them to my mouth, resting my elbows on my knees. Tearing through the silence like a needle tears through flesh, a long, deep howl echoed outside. It was that thing. My heart filled with unmistakable dread as the haunting howl bellowed through the night. It didn't sound too far off. The cabin wasn't too far from the place where I had originally seen the beast, and judging by the sounds of the yelps and yips of the wolves as it tore them to shreds, it wasn't far from that point. Maybe a mile and a half at most. As the indelible howl sent a shiver down my spine, I noticed something even more menacing than that awful cry. The corpse of the man who died before my very eyes began to convulse. It wasn't twitching like there was some activation of nerves, but actual convulsions, like he was having a seizure. A sickly red foam began to pour from the corners of his mouth as he writhed in his chair, and somehow it seemed that the slash in his stomach began to bleed more profusely than before. His eyes regained the light of life, but not the same life. They slowly began to appear cloudy, as if storm clouds were rolling in over his iris, and they had attached themselves to me. His head leaned forward, never breaking eye contact with me, and his body still tremoring out of control. He began to scream like he was in immense agony, but he managed to get out 2 words before he became something else entirely. "Shoot me!" His body began to morph in ways beyond my imagination. As he shook, his mouth ajar, his teeth began to be pushed out of his gums by a new set of teeth. The new teeth were dog-like and too big for his human mouth. Blood gushed from his gums down his face. His arms and legs elongated, the bones snapping out of place and pushing themselves back in place to form new limbs. His feet stretching out of his boots, and claws sprouted from them, cutting through the leather boots on his feet. His mass increased over his entire body. His muscles became more defined and sluggishly grew to inhuman size, ripping through his clothing, revealing flesh that had begun turning gray and sprouting coarse black fur from it. His mouth and nose grew as one. The bones in his face seemed to all snap apart first, but then they seemed to unnaturally extend from his skull, stretching the flesh on his face to fit his new snout. His lips receded into his jaws, revealing a maw full of razor teeth and black, almost infected-looking gums. His ears stretched out until they were the pointed ears of a canine. Claws shot through the tips of his fingers and toes, splitting open the flesh, which then peeled off on its own like a reptile shedding its skin. Through the whole horrific transformation, his eyes grew even cloudier, until they looked just like the eyes of the beast I saw in the woods. In a state of thoughtless panic, I grabbed my rifle shouldered it, and fired. The bullet landed in the center of his chest, a chest now covered in black fur which sprouted from his entire body. The bullet hole it created didn't even bleed, and the creature barely reacted to it. As the transformation finished, it stood on its hind legs, foul-smelling drool pooling beneath its feet as it glared at me. I threw the rifle down, as my frenzied mind remembered what the man had said before he transformed into this gargantuan creature that I had so flippantly disregarded. I practically dove for the revolver on the mantel, and it sprung after me, its hands held out in front of its body as if to catch me. It knocked me over onto the mantel, and I fell flat on my back. It seemed to spring off me and land in the corner of the room, now pacing on all fours, its unnatural-looking, elongated limbs flexing in ways that made them look almost backwards. Just as it was about to pounce again, I snatched up the revolver, cocked the hammer back, pointed, and fired. The shot rang out in the cabin and gun smoke filled the air. There was so much smoke floating around the muzzle, it looked like a war zone, and I could barely make out the shape of the beast staggering and struggling to stand. I stood and waved my hand back and forth to dissipate the smoke and cautiously advanced towards the fallen beast. Blood profusely raged from the wound like vicious river rapids cutting through a riverbed. The corpse began to morph once more, but this time the bones rearranged themselves back into human shapes. The man's eyes cleared of their shrouding clouds, and he shed the fur in clumps onto the floor, leaving behind porous holes in his skin until all that remained was his naked human body, still visibly damaged from the transformation. His fingers looked as though they had stab wounds at the end of them from where the terrible claws had burst through them. His mouth still leaked blood, but his teeth never grew back. The canines which had pushed out his teeth during the transfiguration fell from his head, some rattling out onto the floor, and some falling into the back of his throat as he lay motionless. He had developed loose skin around all of the parts of his body that had stretched out and morphed into unnatural elongation. The bullet dug a trench in his chest, and after it bled an almost inhuman amount of thick, iron-scented rivers, finally bubbled the last squelches of crimson from it, and remained a gaping hole. As I gawked at the hideous mound of loose skin covered in blood on the floor, unable to fully process what my mind had just endured, the low howl bellowed once more from outside. But this time, it sounded slightly closer than before. I had to leave. It had gotten in the house once before, and ferociously slaughtered the man who lived here as he slept. I was not safe in the house. I left my rifle, but kept firm hold of the old revolver in my right hand and started out the door hurriedly. I noticed the burst cap had not fully removed itself from the revolver when it discharged, so before going any further, I grabbed the jagged knife-like edge of the percussion cap, the remainder of which wrapped around the back of the nipple of the revolver, and excavated the shattered pieces from around it, so as to not gum up the mechanism. Once the revolver was ready, I pulled the hammer back again, preparing it to fire, and bolted out into the night. I had never run so fast in my entire life. My legs felt like they wanted to buckle under me and give way as I pushed them beyond the limits of what I knew they were capable of. I shot through the valley and began climbing up the incline, using both my legs and my hands, disregarding the potential danger of pushing the ancient gun into the soil posed. The volatility of the powder never even crossed my mind once as I raced up the incline, occasionally using the thickly packed trees to pull myself up. My lungs screamed in burning torment as the cold night air pushed in and out of them, but I barely even noticed. As I reached the top of the incline and stopped for a moment to get my bearings in order, I heard something I couldn't over my own footsteps and rapid, panicked breaths. The heavy footfalls of the beast advancing on my position. It was still a ways away, but it moved quickly, and I knew that. I had to force my body to keep going. Lifting my arms and legs to sprint towards the highway was like lifting anvils. The beast was gaining on me as I reached the tree line, confident that if I looked back now, I would be able to see it snapping its jaws at the heels of my feet. I reached in my pockets with my free hand and fished the keys to my truck out of it. I could see my salvation, but as the footsteps and now the deep, panting breaths grew louder and closer than ever before, I could also hear my damnation. My hand white-knuckled the door handle. I threw it open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut, seemingly all in one fluid motion. It was silent in the cab of the truck, except for my wheezing breaths and my heartbeat, which I could hear pounding in my ears. I wanted desperately to make this all just one dreadful memory. I started the truck and turned on the headlights. I half expected to see the terrible creature lunging at my windshield as I turned them on, but I saw nothing except for the boundless expanse of the forest's blackness just beyond my headlights. As I put the truck in reverse, however, I could see two gleaming eyes reflecting my head beams back at me, 8 feet above the ground, in the trees. The beast's body just out of the reach of the full blast of my headlights' glow. My hand, though now stationed on the steering wheel, was still tightly gripping the revolver, and as I saw those terrible eyes staring back at me, I could feel my hand tense up around the grip. I briefly contemplated stepping out of the truck and shooting into the night, hoping I killed it. Hoping it would purge me of having to ponder the existence of this beast ever again. As I sat in the cab, watching the two gleaming eyes, seeing puffs of steam periodically appearing below them as the creature exhaled, I knew I couldn't. My heart felt ready to explode. I needed to leave and push all of this as far away from my memory as I could. I quickly reversed the truck and started down the highway. And that was the last that I ever saw of the creature, or of those woods. I still have the revolver and its ammunition. I have since unloaded it, just as the man said as the life slipped from him. The 5 remaining balls loaded in the gun were made of pure silver. I often wonder about the mysterious man who poured out his heart to me about his sins and about the beast he was there to hunt. I wonder who the beast was under all of his grim flesh attire. I wonder if he's still out there. I wonder if there are any other men who hunt these things. I stay away from the woods now, but I still wonder. And I still hear that haunting howl, lower than the howl of any creature of the woods, wailing to me in my dreams.